I was standing in knee-deep water with mud between my toes when my own grown-up son shouted, "Shut up, old man," and shoved me furiously backwards into the cold lake. My phone slipped from my pocket, but what he didn't know was that the conversation leading up to that very moment had already been recorded and saved in the cloud. Before we dive into how this unfolded, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what you're doing right now while you listen. Years before that push, I was just a widower named Henry, living outside Topeka, Kansas, who woke up before sunrise to brew coffee, feed the chickens, and check the weather forecast as if it could change my day. My son Jake was born on June 14, 1991, in a delivery room where the doctor joked about Flag Day while I held my wife's hand until my knuckles turned white. We brought him home to a small 2-bedroom house with avocado green carpeting, and I built his crib from pine boards, sanding every slat until they were smooth enough for a newborn. By the time he could walk, Jake followed me like a duckling around our property, picking up stray nails and stacking them on the porch rail, imitating my careful nature. We grew up together in a way, me learning patience as a father, and him learning the value of hard work as we repaired fences and painted trim under Kansas suns that made the tar melt on the shingles. Lisa, my wife, passed away from breast cancer when Jake was 12, and grief became another task on my list. I had to be father and mother and still keep the lights on. I held on to routine like a lifeline, writing down bills in a ledger, cooking dinner at 6 sharp, and making sure Jake's homework was done before he could ride his bike down to the creek. When he was 16, he begged me for a smartphone, and after saving up for months, I bought him one, reminding him that technology is a tool and not a toy. He grew up in a world where everything could be documented, and yet he never learned that those digital trails could also be used for accountability. Jake went off to Kansas State University to study marketing, just like his mother had encouraged, and I worked extra hours pouring concrete and hanging drywall to help pay tuition. Every Sunday, I'd drive the 50 miles to Manhattan with a cooler full of casseroles and Tupperware, and we'd sit on the campus lawn talking about his classes and my latest carpentry project. He was charming, bright, and quick with numbers, qualities that served him well when he landed a job right out of college at a regional logistics firm. In those days, we still had a friendship. He'd call me on his commute to tell me about his wins at work and ask my advice on whether to buy or rent when he got his own place. But somewhere between his promotions and my gray hairs, his respect for me began to wane, hidden beneath jokes about me being old school and his insistence that I needed to relax. He started dating a woman named Casey in 2019, a social media manager who always had her phone out and who once told me she couldn't imagine life without an Instagram filter. Casey was nice enough on the surface, but she had a way of calling Jake babe in a tone that made me feel like he was a product she was marketing rather than a partner she loved. They moved in together in an apartment downtown that cost more than our mortgage ever had, and they furnished it with mid-century modern reproductions and plants that Casey watered with a glass spray bottle. I helped them mount a flat screen on their wall one Saturday, and Jake joked that my drill was older than his relationship. I laughed but tucked the comment away in my mind like a nail not yet hammered. In late 2022, Jake called to tell me they were planning a lakeside engagement party at Shawnee Lake and wanted me to contribute financially. He said the venue required a $10,000 deposit to reserve the pavilion and hire a caterer, and he asked if I could write the check because he and Casey were cash poor after paying for a photographer and a custom neon sign. Because I loved my son and wanted him to feel supported, I agreed and went with him to the bank, where the branch manager once again reminded me about funds availability. Only $200 of the deposit would be available the next business day, and the rest would be available on the second business day. I wrote the check while Jake scrolled on his phone, and I thought about the difference between the handwritten ledger in my pocket and the digital spreadsheets in his world. The branch manager also casually mentioned that banks could place longer holds on checks over $5,000 if the account was new, but he noted that my 30-year history meant my funds would be available quickly. We left the bank, and Jake gave me a one-armed hug, told me I was the man, and promised that I'd be the guest of honor at the party. I went home, logged the transaction, and then went about my routine, trusting that my son's word was as good as a contract. Weeks later, I got a group text from Casey detailing the dress code for the engagement party and a list of expectations, including no jeans and no political talk because it would ruin the vibe. I replied with a thumbs-up emoji, feeling slightly ridiculous that I had paid for a party where I was being told what to wear and what to talk about. The day of the party arrived warm and breezy, and I put on my nicest button-down shirt, grabbed a six-pack of root beer for the kids attending, and drove to Shawnee Lake. When I arrived, I noticed a sign at the pavilion entrance that read, "Friends and family only, no negative energy," which struck me as both vague and directed at someone. Jake greeted me with a smile and a beer in hand, but Casey barely looked up from arranging centerpieces made of dried flowers and vintage books. I tried to help set up, but Casey shooed me away, saying the aesthetic needed to remain consistent and that my toolbox didn't fit the theme. I retreated to a picnic table near the water and watched the guests arrive, each with their own curated outfits and carefully selected gifts, and I felt like a relic from another time. When Jake finally sat down beside me, he told me that they decided it would be best if I kept my speech at the engagement party short and light because no one wanted to hear about the old days. I smiled to hide my hurt, sipped my root beer, and asked him about the details of the wedding planning, but he brushed me off and said they would figure it out with their wedding planner. Later that afternoon, after the speeches and the cornhole tournaments, Jake asked if I wanted to see the progress on the dock he was helping build for the venue. We walked down to the edge of the lake, past kayaks and children feeding ducks, and as we stood on the dock, he turned to me with a grin and said, "Calm down, old man," then placed both hands on my chest and pushed me into the water. The shock of the cold lake stole my breath, and as I flailed for the dock, I saw him laughing with Casey on the shore, their phones out recording my sputtering like it was a prank for social media. What Jake didn't know was that before we walked down to the lake, I had pressed record on my phone and slid it into my shirt pocket because his tone had set off an alarm bell in my head. As I climbed out of the water, drenched and humiliated, he handed me a towel and said it was just a joke and that I needed to learn to take one. I forced a laugh, my teeth chattering, but inside I felt something shift, respect replaced with resentment, trust replaced with determination. I excused myself, saying I needed to go home and change, and Jake waved me off, turning back to his friends without a second glance. At home, I wrung out my clothes over the sink, pulled my phone from my pocket, and prayed it still worked. It powered on, and the recording was there, saved to the cloud and backed up automatically because I set that feature after reading about data loss in a woodworking forum. I listened to the recording and heard not only the splash, but also Jake telling his friends beforehand that he was going to push me in and capture my reaction for a hilarious TikTok. He even joked that maybe I'd have a heart attack and that it would go viral. Hearing my own child say that about me made my stomach twist and my mind sharpen. I sat at my kitchen table, water dripping from my hair onto the ledger, and realized that kindness without boundaries had put me here, wet and embarrassed, holding evidence of my own humiliation. I opened a notebook and wrote down a plan, because plans are what keep carpenters from cutting the wrong board and fathers from repeating mistakes. First, I called my bank and placed a stop payment on the $10,000 check I had written. The teller told me that because the funds had not yet been fully withdrawn, I could still stop the payment and that a small fee would apply. I paid the fee gladly, knowing that the first $200 would be available immediately, but the remainder was still under the bank's control until the second business day, and that time was my ally. Second, I scheduled a meeting with an estate attorney to revise my will, transferring my assets into a trust that would benefit local charities and educational programs rather than my ungrateful son. Third, I made an appointment with a family therapist not because I thought Jake would join me, but because I needed a professional to affirm that setting boundaries wasn't cruelty, it was self-respect. Fourth, I backed up the recording to multiple locations: my cloud storage, an external hard drive, and a password-protected folder on my computer. Because in our state, one-party consent meant the recording was legal, but I needed to keep it safe. Kansas is a one-party consent state, which means I can record a conversation I'm part of without telling the other party, unlike states like California or Florida, where both parties must agree. With those steps in place, I waited a day and then called Jake to tell him we needed to talk about the party and his behavior. He sounded annoyed, as if I were interrupting his busy schedule. When he arrived at my house, he walked in without knocking, sat at the table, and said, "What's the big deal, Dad?" It was just a joke. I took a deep breath, pressed play on the recording, and watched his face change from bored to alarmed as he heard his own voice planning the push and laughing about the potential for a heart attack. When the recording ended, I told him that what hurt wasn't the push, but the intent behind it and the disrespect for my safety and dignity. I explained that I had canceled the check for the engagement party and that I would no longer be financing his wedding, his honeymoon, or any other event until he showed genuine respect and accountability. Jake's face flushed red, and he stammered that I couldn't do that because contracts had been signed and vendors needed to be paid. I told him that he, not I, had signed those contracts and that the bank's funds availability schedule meant I still had control over the money. The deposit hold policy was there to prevent fraud and protect depositors like me, and I intended to use it. He threatened to cut me off, to never speak to me again, and I told him that was his choice, but that my love did not mean I would bankroll his disrespect. I then handed him a list of therapists and suggested he consider talking to someone about why humiliating his father for likes had seemed acceptable. As he stormed out, he muttered something about me being stuck in the past, and I thought about how the past had built our present and how some traditions, like respect, should never go out of style. Before he left, I also told him that I planned to change the locks on my house because he had walked in without knocking, and I reminded him that as the homeowner, I had that right. If he were a tenant, I would have had to follow the formal eviction process and give proper notice because changing locks or turning off utilities without due process is illegal. Landlords in Kansas cannot legally lock out a tenant or cut off utilities just because rent is late. They must file for eviction through the courts, wait for a judge's order, and then have a sheriff carry out the eviction, and that reminder helped me feel justified in securing my home while staying within the law. I called a local locksmith, scheduled an appointment, and texted Jake to inform him of the change. Not because I owed him notice, but because transparency is always better than secrecy, and I wanted him to know the boundary was physical as well as emotional. The next week was quiet. Jake did not call. Casey blocked me on social media, and I poured my energy into repairing a neighbor's deck and volunteering at the food bank. I told my neighbor Earl what had happened, and he nodded and said, "This is why we write things down, Henry, so we don't forget who we are when others try to tell us." On the day the stop payment went through, the bank called to confirm that the funds were back in my account and that the check was void. I made a mental note to send the bank manager a thank you card. A week later, I received a certified letter from Jake asking for reimbursement for the engagement party expenses and threatening legal action if I didn't comply. I took the letter to my attorney, who chuckled and said that there was no legal basis for his claim and that forging a signature to commit a fraudulent act was far more serious than canceling a check. He reminded me that court calendars are backlogged and that it could take months before any case would even be heard, so threats of immediate legal action were empty. The attorney also pointed out that I could sue for the emotional distress and battery of being pushed into the lake, but I said I had no interest in money. My interest was in boundaries and accountability. I went home, made myself a grilled cheese sandwich, and thought about how my life had taken a turn I never expected because of a cell phone recording and a son's careless push. In the weeks that followed, I found solace in routine. I mowed the lawn in straight lines, chopped wood for winter, and taught a woodworking class at the community center. One evening, a student asked me why I always double-check measurements, and I told him it's because you can't add wood back once you cut it, just like you can't take back words once they're spoken. As summer turned to autumn, Jake's absence in my life was like a missing tooth, noticeable but not fatal, and I began to fill the space with new relationships and old hobbies. I joined a local hiking group, and on Saturdays we'd walk around the same lake where I'd been pushed, the water now a source of tranquility rather than humiliation. One morning on the trail, a stranger recognized me from a video that had circulated online. He said, "You're the dad whose son pushed him in the lake. Good for you for standing up for yourself." I thanked him, shook his hand, and realized that my story had resonated with people who were tired of being doormats for those they loved. At a farmer's market, an elderly woman selling homemade jam told me her granddaughter had stolen her Social Security checks and that she'd gotten them back after recording a confession and taking it to the police. She smiled at me and said, "We have to use the tools we have, honey, even if those tools are smartphones and one-party consent laws." Her words reminded me that technology can be a shield as well as a sword, and I felt less guilty about using my phone to protect myself. Months passed, and one day Jake showed up at my door looking sheepish, his hands in his pockets like a boy again. He apologized without prompting, saying he'd spent time reflecting, talking to a counselor, and reading about respect and boundaries. He admitted that the push into the lake wasn't a joke, but a cruel attempt to appear cool in front of friends, and he said he was ashamed. I listened, and when he finished, I told him I forgave him, but that forgiveness did not mean a reset to the old ways. Trust would have to be rebuilt plank by plank, like a dock after a storm. We agreed to meet for coffee every Sunday to talk and rebuild, not about money or events, but about values, books, and how to fix things without nails. Those coffees became a new routine. We talked about our favorite novels, the price of lumber, and the ethics of social media, and slowly the distance between us shrank like a gap closed by a clamp. I kept my estate plan as it was, with most of my assets going to charity, because love isn't about leaving money, it's about leaving lessons and showing that respect is non-negotiable. I also started volunteering with a local group that teaches seniors how to use smartphones safely, showing them how to back up photos and set up two-factor authentication. At one session, a gentleman asked if he could legally record a caregiver who he suspected was mistreating him, and I carefully explained the differences between one-party and two-party consent states and suggested he speak to an attorney. It felt good to use my experience to help others protect themselves, to turn my lake water into wisdom for someone else's fire. I kept the recording of Jake pushing me on my phone, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of what happens when boundaries are ignored and as evidence in case I ever needed it again. Sometimes I'd watch it and feel the cold water again, hear the laughter, and then look at the man Jake was becoming and feel gratitude for growth. Life is full of second chances, but they're worth nothing if we squander them by ignoring the lessons the first time taught us. Jake eventually married Casey in a small courthouse ceremony they paid for themselves, and though I wasn't at the lake that time, I sent a heartfelt card and a set of hand-carved salad servers. Casey sent a thank you text with a photo of the servers on their table, and though we never became close, our interactions remained cordial and respectful. As for the money I saved by canceling that $10,000 check, I donated part of it to the community center to fund more woodworking classes and used the rest to take a trip to the Ozarks with Earl. On that trip, Earl and I sat by a different lake, sipping coffee and watching the sunrise, and he said, "Henry, sometimes the universe pushes you into the water to show you how well you can swim." I laughed and replied that sometimes it's your own son doing the pushing, but the lesson remains. Bring a towel and make sure your phone is backed up. My phone is now filled with photos of sunsets, finished projects, and smiling faces at the community center. And every once in a while, I'll see the file name of that recording and be reminded of the day my life pivoted. I've learned to keep digital records of conversations that involve money or promises because memory is fallible and technology can be an ally when used responsibly. I've learned that deposit holds at the bank aren't just inconvenient. They're safeguards for people like me who need a day to reconsider whether a check should clear when respect hasn't been cleared. I've learned that court cases can take months or even years to resolve. So you need to gather evidence early and be patient with a system that moves slower than a carpenter's level bubble. I've learned that a phone, a ledger, and a willingness to stand up for yourself can be more powerful than fists or shouting when it comes to reclaiming dignity. If you're listening and you've ever been laughed at by someone you love, know that you deserve respect, and that setting a boundary is a gift to yourself and a teaching tool for others. If you have a smartphone, learn how to use it safely and ethically. Record conversations only where the law allows, and always back up important files. Your future self might thank you. If your child ever disrespects you publicly, remember that your response teaches them how to treat you and themselves. Humility can coexist with firmness. I now keep a laminated card in my wallet with important contacts, my attorney, my bank, and my therapist, because quick access to help is as important as knowing where your hammer is in a crisis. I also keep a note that says, "You are allowed to say no," because sometimes I need that reminder when guilt whispers that love equals financial support. Those Sunday coffees with Jake continue, and though our conversations sometimes dance around difficult topics, there is a new honesty between us that feels like oak, strong, resilient, and beautiful. We laugh about things now, but the laughter feels different, gentle and mutual rather than at someone else's expense, and it tastes like redemption. If you've been holding on to hurt from a family member, I encourage you to write it down, not to dwell, but to see it clearly. Clarity can be the first step to letting go or drawing a line. If you're a parent, teach your children about respect early, and model it by showing respect for yourself. They may roll their eyes, but deep down, they absorb what you show more than what you say. I also encourage you to share your own stories. Whether in a comment or a conversation, your experiences have power to help others feel less alone. Have you ever had to use your phone to protect yourself or to prove something important? If so, I'd love to hear about it. Your comments inspire me to keep sharing, and they help build a community where wisdom is passed like a favorite recipe. When you leave a comment, include where you're listening from. It amazes me to know that my tale from Kansas can reach people in Toronto, Dublin, or Manila who might be facing similar challenges. Sometimes I picture a retiree in Florida nodding while walking on a treadmill, a truck driver in Texas listening between deliveries, or a student in London scribbling notes for their own difficult conversation. These mental images remind me that our stories matter, and that the internet can be a place of connection if we use it to share honestly rather than to humiliate. I hope you'll come back for my next tale, because life keeps giving me lessons to share, whether they're about banks, barns, or boundaries. Take care of your money, take care of your people, and take care of yourself, because at the end of the day, those are the investments that yield the richest returns. And remember, if someone ever says, "Calm down, old man," and tries to push you into something that doesn't feel right, stand tall, step aside, and record the lesson for later. In the months after the confrontation, I found myself revisiting memories like a carpenter inspecting an old table for weak joints, pressing on them to see if they held. I thought about my own father, a man who worked at a grain elevator and never missed a church potluck, and how he taught me that a person's word was their bond. He used to bring home burlap sacks full of wheat, and I'd help him spread the kernels out to dry on the porch, feeling the roughness under my small fingers. We didn't have much, but what we had was ours, paid for with sweat and stubbornness, and that instilled in me a sense of pride and ownership. When I was 15, I saved up money from mowing lawns to buy a used transistor radio, and I remember the thrill of tuning it to a station playing Johnny Cash while sanding a chair. That radio sat on my workbench for decades, its plastic dial worn smooth by my thumb, and it became the soundtrack to my early marriage and late nights in the shop. I met Lisa at a church fundraiser where I was flipping pancakes, and she laughed when I splattered batter on my apron and offered me a towel from her purse. Our first date was at the county fair, riding the Ferris wheel and sharing a paper tray of curly fries, and we talked about dreams that were half-formed but heartfelt. Lisa wanted to be a teacher, and I wanted to build houses, and somehow we managed to do both, navigating a world that was simpler in technology but just as complex in emotion. When Jake was born, our house felt full, even though it was small, because his cries echoed off the wood paneling and his laughter filled every corner like sunshine. He grew up playing with wooden blocks that I had sanded to smooth edges, using them to build imaginary castles and garages before graduating to real nails and hammers. During his teenage years, we fought about curfews and car keys, but we always made up over late-night grilled cheese sandwiches and conversations on the porch swing. Jake would come home smelling like gasoline from working at the local gas station, and I'd smell like sawdust and polyurethane, and somehow those scents mixed into something like home. In those days, my phone was attached to the wall by a cord, and privacy meant stretching it around a corner to whisper while your mother cooked spaghetti. Now, privacy is a setting on an app, consent is a notification, and the idea of boundaries has to be spelled out in texts and emails because assumptions lead to misunderstandings. I remember when Jake bought his first smartphone, how excited he was about the camera, and how we took silly selfies in front of the barn, not knowing cameras would later capture our pain. Back then, if someone had told me that one day I'd rely on a recording to defend myself against my own child, I would have laughed and called it far-fetched. But life has a way of turning hypotheticals into reality, and the line between story and cautionary tale is often the width of a phone screen. In the weeks after the lake incident, I also thought about the value of money and how easily generosity can be manipulated when love blinds you to red flags. My ledger became more than a record of transactions. It became a journal of feelings I could not share with anyone else: anger, sadness, relief, and strange gratitude. Each line item told a story: the canceled check, the therapy session fee, the donation to the community center, the cost of materials for a birdhouse Jake and I built when he was 10. That birdhouse still hangs from the maple tree near my driveway, weathered but sturdy, and chickadees nest there every spring, a reminder that things built with care endure. I would sit on the porch, notebook in hand, and watch the birds flit in and out while listening to the hum of cicadas, letting my mind drift to all the people who had warned me about enabling loved ones. Some friends had cut off children who took advantage of them. Others had given chance after chance until their own savings dwindled, and I tried to learn from both extremes. It dawned on me that boundaries are like fences. They keep out what you don't want while keeping safe what's inside, and if you don't maintain them, they rot and fall. When neighbors asked why Jake hadn't been around, I was careful not to badmouth him. I simply said we were working on our relationship, which was true and also respectful. Sometimes it felt easier to focus on physical tasks, fixing a wobbly table, repairing a sagging gate, than to fix emotional rifts, but emotional repairs were just as necessary. I found myself talking to a therapist about guilt, a feeling I had rarely entertained. Guilt for saying no, guilt for canceling a check, guilt for recording my son without his knowledge. The therapist told me that guilt is like untreated wood. If you leave it exposed, it warps and cracks. But if you address it, sand it, seal it, it becomes part of the structure rather than a flaw. That metaphor resonated with me, and I went home and sealed an old picnic table, thinking about how each layer of polyurethane is like a therapy session protecting what's underneath. On days when memories of the lake surfaced unexpectedly, I'd take a walk to the hardware store just to browse. The sight of screws neatly arranged in drawers calmed me like organized thoughts. The young clerks would greet me by name and ask if I needed help, and I'd reply that sometimes you just need to be around possibilities without buying anything. I'd pick up a hinge and think about doors, how they pivot on small pieces of metal, and how relationships pivot on small moments like a push or an apology. During one of my visits, I overheard a woman telling the cashier about a contractor who never showed up and how she had recorded his promises. It struck me that recordings are modern receipts. I chatted with her in the parking lot about one-party consent states and the importance of documenting agreements, and she thanked me, scribbling notes on a receipt as if it were a wooden scrap. That interaction made me realize that sharing my story wasn't just therapeutic. It could be educational, helping others avoid similar mistakes. I decided to start writing down more than numbers. I began jotting down my experiences as stories, each with a lesson, like chapters of a handbook for life after betrayal. The first story I wrote was about the lake incident, of course, but the second was about the time Jake borrowed my truck in high school and returned it with an empty tank and a mumbled apology. Writing about that minor transgression helped me see how patterns form. Small disrespect unchecked can grow into bigger ones, just as water seeping into a crack can freeze and widen it. Once, while organizing my garage, I found a box of Jake's childhood toys, a wooden train I made, a faded baseball glove, a science fair ribbon for a baking soda volcano. Holding those items made my heart ache, not with regret, but with a bittersweet awareness that the boy who had cherished these things was still somewhere inside the man who pushed me. I realized then that love doesn't evaporate. It transforms, sometimes into disappointment, sometimes into hope, but it's always there like moisture in the air. That realization softened my anger and allowed room for compassion, not as an excuse for Jake's behavior, but as a reason not to let bitterness corrode me like rust on a hinge. One Saturday I attended a free legal clinic at the library because I wanted to learn more about my rights and responsibilities regarding recording laws and financial support. The attorney there explained again that Kansas is a one-party consent state and that my recording could be used in court if necessary, and he advised me to always document any agreements in writing. He also mentioned that courts are backlogged, sometimes for months or even years, and that seeking mediation or counseling can resolve family disputes faster than litigation. I left that clinic feeling empowered and informed, with pamphlets in hand and a new appreciation for professionals who donate their time to educate others. On my way home, I stopped by the farmer's market and bought a jar of honey from an elderly couple who told me they had been married for 50 years and never went to bed angry. They laughed and admitted that sometimes they just stayed up arguing, but that honesty had kept their relationship strong. Their banter reminded me that communication is an active practice. Sitting under a shade tree with my honey and pamphlets, I wrote in my journal about how important it is to build relationships on truth rather than appearances. Another day I volunteered at a high school career day and spoke to teenagers about trades like carpentry and electrical work, and I wove in a lesson about respect and technology. I told them that even if you work with your hands, you need to know the laws about recording, the policies about bank holds, and the ethics of consent. Knowledge is your toolbox. Some kids listened politely, others rolled their eyes, but one boy came up afterward and asked for my email so he could send me his resume for an apprenticeship. That small moment of connection felt like redemption for all the times I'd felt dismissed. It reminded me that young people can surprise you when given guidance. I also began reading books I'd long put off, novels, biographies, and even a self-help book about setting boundaries, which gave me language to describe what I was feeling. In one novel, a father and son reconcile after years of misunderstanding, and I wept at a scene where they build a bench together, because it mirrored my own hopes. Reading about others' struggles and triumphs made my own situation feel less unique and less isolating. There is comfort in shared human experience. I started going to a senior center twice a week to teach woodworking to retirees who wanted to learn something new, and we'd swap stories while sanding and staining. One man told me his daughter tried to get him to co-sign on a risky loan, and he refused, only to be called selfish. He said my story gave him courage to stand firm. Another woman said her son expected her to babysit every weekend without asking if she had plans. Hearing my story reminded her that it's okay to say no, even to loved ones. These conversations confirmed that boundaries are a universal issue, not confined to my family, and that sharing our stories can serve as map markers for others navigating similar terrain. As fall progressed, I noticed how the leaves change color gradually. One day they're green, the next they hold a hint of yellow, and soon they blaze orange and red. It struck me that relationships change in similar gradients. Seldom is there a single moment that turns everything, rather a series of small changes that accumulate until the landscape is different. I've learned to pay attention to those subtle shifts, a dismissive tone, a repeated request for money, a joke that cuts too deep, because they often signal bigger issues brewing. Just as I inspect lumber for knots and warping before using it, I now inspect interactions for signs of disrespect before agreeing to anything significant. Sometimes on quiet evenings I'd take a drive through old neighborhoods where Jake played as a child, and I'd slow down near the park where we once flew kites. I remembered teaching him to hold the string tightly and feel the pull of the wind, a simple lesson in forces that cannot be seen but can be harnessed. That kite would dip and rise, and I'd tell him to run faster when it sagged. Now I realize how many times in life you have to adjust your pace to keep something airborne. Driving past our old schools, I wondered about Jake's teachers and whether any of them would be surprised to hear about the man he became. Would they see it as predictable or shocking? I also thought about how teachers manage classrooms full of personalities, how they set rules and boundaries from day one, and how maybe parents need to adopt similar clarity. On a whim, I attended a beginner's yoga class at the community center because a friend said it might help with the tension I carried after the lake incident. I was the oldest and stiffest person there, but as I held poses and focused on my breath, I realized that flexibility in body mirrors flexibility in mind. The instructor ended the class by telling us to thank ourselves for showing up, and those words made me tear up because I had shown up for myself in a way I hadn't before. I thanked my body for climbing out of the lake, my mind for devising a plan, and my heart for remaining open to forgiveness. On the drive home, I marveled at how new experiences can teach us new metaphors for old problems. Sometimes you need a yoga mat instead of a workbench to process pain. I continued to see my therapist, and we delved deeper into my fear of being alone in old age and my tendency to equate financial support with love. She asked me to imagine a future where Jake and I never reconciled and where most of my estate went to strangers. Surprisingly, the thought didn't terrify me. Instead, it illuminated that my worth isn't tied to being needed financially. My worth is inherent, as is everyone's, whether or not they have children. We also explored my feelings about technology, and I confessed that part of me felt shame for using a phone recording like evidence. She reminded me that tools are neutral and intent defines their morality. She said if a hammer can build or destroy, so can a recording. It's how you use it and why that matters. This perspective freed me from lingering guilt and allowed me to see the recording as an extension of my boundaries rather than a betrayal. I learned to appreciate the complexity of modern life, where bank holds, consent laws, and digital backups are part of responsible adulthood. There was a day when I went to the DMV to renew my license, and I brought along my notebook to jot down observations because waiting rooms are fertile ground for stories. I watched a young man argue with a clerk about a suspended license, and I saw an elderly woman help him fill out a form he didn't understand. Kindness surfaces in unexpected places. I chatted with a truck driver who told me he listened to True Story podcasts during long hauls and that he hoped I'd share more of mine. That conversation inspired me to record audio versions of my stories for friends who can't read small text. My phone became a storytelling device rather than just a defense tool. I set up a small microphone in my dining room and recorded myself reading my lake story aloud, pausing when I cried and laughing when I realized how far I'd come. Hearing my own voice narrate my pain was cathartic, and I uploaded the recording to a private link for a friend going through a divorce. He later told me it gave him strength to set his own boundaries. As winter approached, I prepared the house for cold, caulking windows, stacking firewood, and remembering the winter when Jake and I built a fort out of cardboard boxes in the living room. We strung Christmas lights inside and pretended we were explorers in the Arctic, sipping hot chocolate and whispering secrets like explorers share secrets around a fire. Those memories warmed me, literally and figuratively, and made the silence of his absence less hollow, because I could hear the echo of his childhood laughter in the rustling of fire. On Christmas morning, I woke to a text from Jake that simply said, "Merry Christmas, Dad." And I replied with a photo of a snow-covered sunrise and a heart emoji. It wasn't much, but it was something, and sometimes something is all you need to keep hope alive. New Year's came, and instead of making resolutions, I made intentions to maintain my boundaries, to stay open to reconciliation, to continue sharing my story, and to learn new skills, even if they seem trivial. I signed up for a watercolor painting class and discovered that blending colors is like blending emotions. Too much water and it becomes a wash, too little and the edges are harsh. The instructor complimented my clouds, and I laughed because she had no idea how many real clouds I'd watched roll over Kansas fields while mulling over life decisions. Painting allowed me to express things I couldn't put into words, like the feeling of betrayal swelling like a storm, or the calm after taking decisive action like blue sky after rain. When I showed my paintings to Jake, he smiled genuinely and said he was proud of me for trying something new. That small exchange felt like progress, like the first bud on a wintered tree. As months turned into a year, the recording of the lake incident moved lower on my phone's recent files list, replaced by photos of new friends, woodworking projects, and drawings. It remained there, though, a quiet sentinel reminding me that even the worst day can lead to growth if you handle it with grace and grit. One rainy afternoon, I sat down to write thank you notes to everyone who had supported me, my therapist, the attorney at the clinic, the bank manager, the neighbor who listened without judgment, and even the yoga instructor. Expressing gratitude to them made me realize how community forms. Sometimes it's family by blood, and sometimes it's a patchwork of people who appear at just the right time. I wrote a letter to myself, too, thanking the man who climbed out of the lake, who pressed record, who said no, and who continued to show up for coffee with his son. Writing to myself felt odd at first, but it turned into an exercise in self-compassion that I wished I'd learned decades earlier. If you've never written a letter to yourself, I recommend it. You might be surprised at how kind you can be when you treat yourself as you would a friend. As spring rolled back around, the maple tree in my yard budded fresh leaves, and the birdhouse Jake and I built welcomed a new clutch of chicks cheeping at dawn. Life repeats itself in cycles, and each cycle offers a chance to do things differently. You can't undo the past, but you can plant new seeds and nurture them intentionally. This spring, Jake and I built a planter box together, not because we needed one, but because we needed a project that required teamwork and time. We measured twice, cut once, laughed about crooked cuts, and by the end of the afternoon, we had both a planter and another layer of trust. We filled the box with soil and herb seedlings, basil, rosemary, thyme, and I joked that we were literally growing time together, and we both laughed, the pun breaking some residual tension. Watching those herbs grow on the kitchen windowsill became another routine we shared. He'd text me pictures of his half of the planter, and I'd send pictures of mine. Something about caring for living things together fosters care for each other. It's hard to be resentful when you're both invested in the same fragile sprouts. During this time, I also became more involved in consumer advocacy groups that educate seniors about financial scams and predatory lending. At one meeting, a speaker discussed the Expedited Funds Availability Act and how banks are required to make the first $200 of a deposit available quickly, but can hold the rest to prevent fraud. I shared my story of stopping a $10,000 check and explained how understanding those rules saved me from financing disrespect. Heads nodded and pens scratched notes. After the meeting, a couple approached me to say they had always felt guilty about setting limits with their adult son, who kept asking for money. They said my story gave them permission to protect themselves. Hearing that reinforced that vulnerability can be powerful when it helps others feel less ashamed about their boundaries. I started carrying copies of a handout about recording laws and funds availability rules in my glove compartment, ready to pass them out like business cards when someone needed them. It amused me to think of myself as a walking combination of carpenter and legal aid, but in a world where information is power, sharing knowledge is a service. I also discovered podcasts about psychology, personal finance, and storytelling, and I'd listen to them while sanding boards or driving to the grocery store. One episode discussed how our brains crave narrative closure, which is why unresolved conflicts feel so uncomfortable. Knowing that helped me be patient when my relationship with Jake felt like a cliffhanger. Another episode featured a mother who cut off a toxic child to save her own sanity, and while our situations differed, I admired her courage and took notes on her communication strategies. The more I listened, the more I realized that my story was not an isolated event, but part of a larger conversation about aging, respect, and autonomy. Sometimes I'd pause the podcast and talk back to the host as if they could hear me, agreeing or disagreeing while gesturing with a sandpaper block. These one-sided conversations were cathartic and made me laugh at myself, which is a wonderful antidote to seriousness. On evenings when podcasts weren't enough, I'd call Earl and we'd sit in our rocking chairs on my porch, discussing everything from crop prices to the latest legal rulings on property rights. Earl, who had no children, would shake his head at my stories and then share tales of his brothers trying to scam him out of inherited land. Families everywhere have similar themes. He'd say, "Henry, at least you had the mind to record it and the heart to forgive." And I'd nod, grateful for his perspective and companionship. During one such conversation, a thunderstorm rolled in, and we watched lightning dance across the sky while sipping hot tea, the kind of storm that makes you feel small and significant at once. The smell of rain on dry earth, petrichor, filled the air, and I thought about how forgiveness is like rain. It doesn't undo the drought, but it nourishes new growth. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, letting the sound of rain punctuate our thoughts, and I realized that some of the best support is presence without words. Another source of support came unexpectedly from a young woman at the grocery store who recognized me and whispered, "Thank you for telling your story. My brother recorded our father yelling, and now he has help." Her eyes welled with tears, and I squeezed her shoulder, feeling the ripple effect of my story in a way I hadn't anticipated. That encounter reminded me that telling the truth can inspire others to seek justice and healing, and that silence sometimes enables harm to continue. I also received handwritten letters from strangers who had heard my story. One man wrote that he played the recording for his son, and it sparked an honest discussion about respect. Another woman said she was hesitant to record her son's threats because she didn't know the law, but after learning about one-party consent, she did and used it to obtain a restraining order. These letters were tucked into my ledger like little blessings, each one reinforcing that being vulnerable has value beyond catharsis. Of course, not all responses were supportive. Some online commenters called me petty for canceling the check, telling me I should have swallowed my pride to keep the peace. At first, those comments stung, but I reminded myself that strangers don't live my life or feel the weight of cold lake water on their chest. I wrote back to a few, respectfully explaining that peace without respect is just silence under pressure, and that boundaries are not bitterness. To my surprise, some wrote back and thanked me for the explanation. Through these interactions, I learned that even disagreement can be constructive if approached with curiosity rather than defensiveness. As the second summer since the incident rolled around, Jake and I planned a camping trip together, something we hadn't done since he was in high school. We packed fishing gear, tents, and, per my insistence, life jackets, and he joked that he wouldn't push me into any bodies of water. On the drive to the campsite, we listened to old country songs and newer alternative tracks, taking turns picking music and learning about each other's tastes. Setting up camp required teamwork, and as we staked the tent, Jake apologized again for the lake incident, this time adding how embarrassed he felt every time he heard the recording. I told him embarrassment can be a good teacher if you listen to it, and he nodded, hammering a stake into the dirt with a gentleness that belied his strength. Under the stars that night, we talked about trust, about how I needed to see consistent respect and how he needed to feel heard, and we both promised to keep communicating. The next morning, we caught 2 fish and released them, laughing as they splashed us, and the water felt like a friend again rather than an enemy. On the drive home, we stopped at a roadside diner, and Jake insisted on paying. Watching him sign the receipt felt like a passing of a baton, a symbol that he was learning to give as well as receive. Later that week, I wrote about the camping trip in my journal, detailing the smell of pine needles, the crackle of the fire, and the softness of his apology repeated under a canopy of trees. I read that entry aloud into my phone recorder and sent it to him. He replied with a voice memo saying he had saved it and would listen whenever he needed a reminder of how far we'd come. Technology, once the source of our conflict, had become a tool for connection, and I marveled at the irony and grace of that transformation. One afternoon, while scrolling through photos on my phone, I noticed how the composition of my life had shifted. There were fewer pictures of checks and more of smiles, meals, and sunsets. There was a photo of my hand holding a mug of coffee, with Jake's hand holding a similar mug across the table, our hands still rough but resting now rather than trembling. I realized I had taken control of my narrative not by cutting anyone out permanently, but by refusing to subsidize disrespect, by documenting truth, and by seeking help when needed. If you're still listening and wondering if you should stand up for yourself, I hope you take my story as permission to do so with calm determination. If you're someone who has hurt a parent, I hope you realize apology and change can bridge wide gaps, and that dignity restored is dignity shared. And if you're simply enjoying this as a tale with your morning coffee, I hope you find a piece of your own life reflected in these paragraphs and carry it with you today. In quiet moments, I also ponder the passage of time, how decades can feel like minutes in hindsight, while single conversations can stretch like hours in discomfort. When I was 20, a year seemed an eternity, full of endless possibilities. Now, each year feels like a plank you set carefully in place, aware of its weight and permanence. I remember being 30 and thinking 50 was ancient, yet 50 came and went, and I still felt like that young man in the grain elevator, albeit with more wrinkles and wisdom. Growing older has humbled me, not because of physical limitations, but because of the realization that many of the things I worried about never came to pass, while surprises I never imagined shaped me profoundly. Often I think about Lisa and what advice she might have given during the lake incident. She was always the mediator, the one who believed in gentle firmness. She might have told me to stand up for myself, but also to leave the door ajar for reconciliation, advice that I tried to follow even when my pride protested. There are days when I still miss her laugh, a sound that could diffuse tension faster than a joke, and I wonder if Jake remembers it or if it has faded to a whisper in his memory. Sometimes grief and anger mingle like stain and varnish, creating a finish that's both protective and dark, and I have learned to live with that complexity. On warm evenings, I take long walks down country roads lined with sunflowers, their heads turned toward the sun, and I think about how plants instinctively seek light. I ask myself what my light is, and I keep coming back to respect, honesty, and growth. They are my North Star, my reason to lean toward healing rather than harboring resentment. During one walk, I met a young mother pushing a stroller. She recognized me and asked how she could teach her toddler about boundaries before he was old enough to test them. I told her that boundaries aren't fences you build overnight, but habits you demonstrate daily, like saying please and thank you, like apologizing when you're wrong, like listening when someone says no. She thanked me and said she would start by talking about feelings and respect at the dinner table, and I smiled, thinking of the small ripples our conversation might create. Another evening, I bumped into a former coworker at the grocery store who asked why I looked lighter, and I laughed, saying that letting go of guilt can shed pounds invisible to the scale. We reminisced about old job sites where we'd sweat in August heat, making jokes and passing water jugs, and how those days felt simpler because our responsibilities were clear. I told him about the lake incident, and he shook his head, then confessed that his own daughter had asked for money for a business that failed, leaving him in debt. We talked by the frozen food aisle for 20 minutes, our ice cream melting slightly, commiserating and sharing resources about financial counseling and legal protections. It struck me that grocery stores, like banks and lakes, can be sites of profound human exchange if you're willing to linger and listen. I began to see that vulnerability is contagious. When I shared my story, others felt safe to share theirs, and in doing so, we built networks of mutual support. There's a unique kind of wisdom that emerges when older men discuss feelings over bags of peas and carrots, and I wish society valued it more openly. On one of my therapy visits, my therapist asked me to write a letter to Jake that I would never send, expressing every thought uncensored. I filled pages with anger, disappointment, hope, and love, writing until my hand cramped, and then I read it aloud to an empty room, letting the words echo. Afterward, I burned the letter safely in my fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken, a ritual that left me feeling lighter and surprisingly calmer. Rituals have always been important in my life: Sunday dinners, morning coffee, writing in my ledger, and now I added intentional release to that list. Another ritual I adopted was weekly gratitude lists, forcing my mind to find silver linings even when my heart felt heavy. Gratitude doesn't erase pain, but it balances it. I'd write down things like good health, Earl's jokes, a well-sealed roof, a text from Jake, and the smell of fresh bread, and feel a subtle shift toward contentment. Once, gratitude included, my phone didn't die in the lake, a practical but profound blessing, because technology enabled me to set boundaries and share my story. I've started to pay more attention to the details of my surroundings, noticing things like how the paint on the hardware store door chips, revealing layers of previous colors. This attention has spilled over into relationships. I notice when someone looks tired, when they force a smile, when they fidget while asking for help. Observation, I've learned, is a form of care. By truly seeing others, you acknowledge their existence and worth, something I missed doing with Jake during his drifting years. One morning at the diner, I saw a father and teenage son arguing about screen time, and I wanted to step in and tell them to both put down their phones and talk. I didn't, because unsolicited advice rarely lands well, but I sent them silent good wishes and hoped they could find common ground without a push or a recording. Sometimes people ask me if I regret pressing record, and I tell them no, because that recording was my lifeline in a moment of disrespect. But I also say, I wish I hadn't needed it. Recording someone you love feels odd, like acknowledging that trust has been compromised, but I remind myself that acknowledging a problem is the first step toward fixing it. If you're thinking about recording a conversation, check your state's laws, be clear about your reasons, and consider whether the act aligns with your long-term goals for the relationship. On a lighter note, I've started singing more, not professionally, but while sanding or cooking, humming old tunes that Lisa loved, and new songs Jake suggests. Music lifts my mood and bridges gaps between generations. Sometimes Jake and I exchange song recommendations, and it feels like a secret handshake no one else knows. He introduced me to a band that blends folk and electronic music, and I played him Merle Haggard. We both expanded our playlists, proof that differences can enrich rather than divide. Recently, I attended a concert in the park where the local symphony played under the stars, and as the strings swelled, I felt emotions cresting like waves on the lake. The conductor spoke about harmony, explaining how each instrument has its part and how chaos becomes music when everyone listens and responds. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. I applied it to my relationship with Jake. Our voices had clashed, but with listening and timing, we could create something beautiful together. As the concert ended, the audience lit sparklers, and I held mine up, thinking about how small lights together can illuminate a dark park. Perhaps our shared stories are such lights. On days when I felt particularly reflective, I'd drive to the town cemetery and walk the rows, reading names and dates, wondering about the stories between the dash on each stone. It sounds morbid, but it grounded me. Seeing centuries of lives reminded me that conflicts like mine are not new, and that resolution is possible even when you're not around to see it. I visited Lisa's grave, cleaned off leaves, and told her about the lake and the letter and the planter box. I like to think she hears me, or at least that speaking calms me. After one visit, I wrote that conversation down and shared it with Jake, who said it made him cry and inspired him to visit his own mother's grave more often. Grief and reconciliation intertwine, each informing the other. Acknowledging one often leads to progress in the other, like how water nourishes roots hidden in soil. I'm often asked how I balanced being firm with being forgiving, and I answer that firmness sets the shape. Forgiveness sands the edges. Both are necessary for a piece to function and look good. When I build a table, I start with solid joints and then I smooth. If you sand before you join, the pieces don't fit right, and if you join without sanding, you get splinters. Similarly, I set my boundary first, no more funding, disrespect, then I sanded with therapy, conversations, and time until the edges weren't sharp anymore. People also ask if I ever showed the recording to anyone besides Jake, and the answer is yes. I played it for my therapist and my attorney to get their perspectives. The attorney confirmed it was admissible because of one-party consent, and the therapist helped me process the emotions it stirred. Sharing it responsibly kept me from using it as gossip. I encourage others to share their evidence with professionals rather than spreading it as revenge. Information can heal when directed wisely, but harm when weaponized. There were days I struggled with loneliness in the aftermath, despite my busy schedule, and I learned to sit with that feeling instead of drowning it with busyness. I'd make a cup of tea, sit by the window, and simply let sadness ebb and flow like wind through the trees, reminding myself that feelings are temporary visitors. In those quiet hours, I sometimes flipped through old photo albums, the paper kind, and touched the glossy prints with reverence, feeling the texture of time on my fingertips. I'd smile at Jake's bowl haircut at age 4, laugh at my own mustache phases, and cry at the sight of Lisa's eyes crinkled at the edges. These photos grounded me, connecting past joy with present pain and future hope, a continuum captured in fading colors and curled corners. If you still keep physical photos, I recommend pulling them out now and then. There's something about holding memory that scrolling can't replicate. As part of my new hobbies, I joined a community choir for seniors, even though I can't read music well. The director said enthusiasm was more important than precision. We sang old standards and even attempted a contemporary pop song. Our voices wavered, but our hearts were in it, and the process of blending voices taught me patience. Standing in the back row, I realized that being part of a group means sometimes you're heard clearly and sometimes you're part of a chord. Both roles are valuable. At one rehearsal, the director said, "Listen louder than you sing," a directive I took beyond the choir into my daily life, striving to listen more and speak less unless necessary. That advice helped me during a difficult conversation with Jake about his finances. I listened to his concerns, acknowledged his feelings, and still maintained my boundary without yelling. Afterward, he told me he felt heard, even though he didn't get what he wanted, which was a loan for a new truck. He said he respected my decision because of how I delivered it. Moments like that show growth on both sides. His request showed he still leans on me, and my response showed I could say no without burning bridges. People often think boundaries mean walls. I've learned they can be gates, controlled points of access that allow good to enter and keep harm out, adjusted depending on circumstances. One Sunday, our pastor gave a sermon on the prodigal son, and I sat there thinking about how that story ends with a feast but doesn't address future boundaries. I quietly chuckled. I imagined the father in the parable adding a clause, "Welcome home, but the estate is in a trust now, and we need to discuss chores." Religion, like storytelling, often simplifies complex issues, but I found comfort in interpreting parables through my own lived experience rather than taking them at face value. If you are religious, find parts of your faith that support healthy boundaries. If not, draw wisdom from literature, philosophy, or nature, because guidance is everywhere. Speaking of nature, I've deepened my appreciation for Kansas weather. The way the wind smells different before a storm, how the sky turns greenish when hail is coming, and how tornado sirens make your heart race. Weather, like relationships, is predictable in patterns but unpredictable in specifics. You prepare as best you can, but you also have to adapt in the moment. I have a weather radio that sits by my ledger, and I test its batteries every season. That radio is a metaphor for readiness, a reminder to prepare for storms in finances and relationships alike. Another readiness tool is my safe, where I keep important documents, my will, insurance policies, recordings, and I update it regularly, ensuring my executor knows the combination. That safe symbolizes my autonomy. I may not control external events, but I control my preparedness, and that gives me peace. If you don't have a safe or a secure digital vault, consider investing in one. Our memories and plans deserve protection, just like our tools and heirlooms. After hearing my story, a friend confessed she kept her safe combination taped inside a kitchen cabinet. I urged her to memorize it, and she laughed, saying I sounded like her father. We sometimes resist doing hard things like memorizing numbers, but those small efforts can prevent big losses if a dishonest person gains physical access. I also learned that some banks offer safe deposit boxes at low cost, and I rented one to store backups of my recordings and other vital documents. Redundancy reduces anxiety. In addition to the physical safe, I finally embraced password managers, letting technology generate and remember complex passwords for me, rather than relying on the names of pets. It felt strange at first, trusting an app with such information, but it's less strange than having someone hack your email because your password is woodshop123. As a bonus, I turned on two-factor authentication on all my accounts, including cloud storage, making sure that even if one code is compromised, a second barrier remains. These actions might seem unrelated to my story, but they stem from the same principle. Protect what matters and don't assume trust when you can verify. Speaking of verification, I started double-checking bills and bank statements with more scrutiny. Not because I distrust everyone, but because mistakes happen and early detection is easier than recovery. Once I caught a duplicate charge on my credit card, called the company, and resolved it in minutes. Years earlier, I might have ignored it out of inertia. Financial vigilance is self-care, just like exercise and healthy eating. It doesn't have to be obsessive, but it should be consistent. Another aspect of self-care I explored was nutrition. I began cooking more fresh meals, experimenting with herbs from our planter box, and cutting back on processed foods. I noticed that eating better made my energy more stable, which in turn improved my patience and outlook, proving that physical and mental health are intertwined. Jake commented one day that my kitchen smelled like a restaurant, and I invited him to cook with me. We made a vegetable stir-fry and laughed when we burned the first batch. Cooking together provided another opportunity to collaborate without tension, to share responsibility and success, and to enjoy a tangible result of our effort. We also started walking together every Wednesday evening, a tradition we called our walk and talk. Sometimes we discussed deep issues, sometimes we critiqued our neighbors' holiday decorations. These walks became something we both looked forward to, and if one of us had to cancel, we'd reschedule rather than skip, because consistency fosters trust. During one walk, we saw two teenagers fishing and failing to catch anything. Jake shouted advice about bait, and one of them rolled his eyes, but the other listened and thanked him. Jake smiled at me and said, "Teenagers, right?" And I laughed, remembering he had been one, and that time smooths edges even if we think it won't. Our walks sometimes took us past the lake where everything happened. At first I felt a knot in my stomach, but over time that knot loosened as new memories replaced old ones. We sat on that same dock one evening, legs dangling over the water, and Jake apologized yet again, this time for the times he didn't answer my calls or texts when he was younger. I told him I appreciated hearing that, and we tossed pebbles into the lake, watching the ripples expand and intersect, a visual representation of how one action affects many. We talked about generational differences, about how he grew up with constant digital connectivity while I grew up with 3 TV channels and radio, and how expectations for presence differ. He admitted that being constantly online made him feel pressure to perform, to curate his life, and that pushing me into the lake was part of that pressure. Hearing that gave me empathy. I shared that my generation often equated providing financially with love, and that it took a lake incident for me to see other ways to show care. He nodded, understanding dawning. At the end of that conversation, we agreed to keep discussing our assumptions and pressures, because assumptions unexamined become resentments unchecked. Another thing that helped our relationship was working on a community project together, building a free little library box for our neighborhood. We measured, cut, painted, and installed the box, then filled it with books ranging from children's stories to thrillers. Watching people use it brought us joy. We each wrote a note on the inside door. Mine encouraged readers to respect the books and each other. His included a quote about knowledge being power. During the installation, a young girl asked if she could donate her outgrown picture books, and Jake knelt to thank her. Seeing that kindness warmed me and affirmed his growth. The library box became a symbol for us: education, access, generosity, and every time we checked it together, we felt a shared responsibility and pride. One day we found a note inside from someone who said they hadn't read a book in years until they saw our library, and that they were now on their 3rd. Small efforts matter. As we continued to share stories and projects with the world, more people reached out, and some suggested I write a book. The idea intimidated and excited me. I began outlining chapters, combining my journal entries, therapy insights, and lessons into a cohesive narrative, and I even contacted a writing coach. Working on the book forced me to revisit emotions and events in greater detail, but it also allowed me to shape the story intentionally, to include humor and warmth. Writing gave me another avenue to heal and to contribute, and I felt Lisa cheering me on in the quiet hours when the words flowed and the past settled. As I draft this book, I ask myself questions like, what would I tell Henry from 10 years ago? And what do I want Jake's children to know about respect? Answering those questions on paper helps clarify my values and ensures my legacy is more than money. It's guidance and love in written form. I also began to think about the future of my community and how I could support it beyond my lifetime. I met with a financial planner to discuss philanthropic options. We set up a scholarship fund for trade school students who demonstrate not just skill, but kindness, because the world needs electricians who are also empathetic. We also earmarked funds for the Senior Center's Technology Literacy Program, ensuring other elders can learn about consent laws and cybersecurity without feeling overwhelmed. These decisions felt empowering. I may not control how my story is interpreted years from now, but I can control how my resources are deployed. On a lighter note, I treated myself to a used pickup truck that I'd wanted for years. Jake teased me about the color, and we christened it with a trip to the lumberyard. Driving that truck reminded me of the joy of doing things for myself without justification. Self-care can be a new vehicle as much as a new hobby. At the lumberyard, I ran into an old boss who asked if I'd come out of retirement. I laughed and said I was busier than ever, just not with what he thought. He asked about Jake, and I shared our journey in a nutshell. He shook my hand and said he wished he'd stood up to his own son earlier. Then we discussed price of oak versus pine. These chance encounters form threads in the fabric of my life, each conversation adding texture and color, reminding me that we are connected in visible and invisible ways. If you're still reading this far, I want to thank you for walking alongside me through lakes, ledgers, therapy offices, kitchen tables, and hiking trails. Your attention is a form of respect I don't take lightly. If you're thinking of your own life while reading, jot down the moments that resonate. Maybe they'll become paragraphs in your story that you'll share one day. If you're about to stop reading and go do something else, pause for a moment and breathe. Let the lesson settle like sawdust and decide what boundary or connection you'll focus on next. As for me, I'm going to make another cup of coffee, sit on my porch, and look at the herb planter Jake and I built. The time is spilling over, and I take that as a sign that we've grown more than just plants. On the porch, I sometimes write down questions to ask myself like, what did I learn today? And did I honor my boundaries? And that simple practice keeps me accountable to my growth. I also make lists of stories I want to tell next, about neighbors, about projects gone awry, about times I failed and times I triumphed, because life is rich with narratives if you pay attention. If there's a story you want me to tell, leave a suggestion in the comments. Your prompts often lead me to memories I'd forgotten and lessons I hadn't articulated. Remember, your voice matters here. By sharing your own experiences or asking questions, you're adding planks to this community's bridge over troubled waters. Have you ever had to set a boundary with someone you love over money or respect? If so, how did you handle it, and what did you learn from that experience? Leave a comment sharing your story or advice. You never know who might read it and find the courage to act kindly but firmly because of your words. As always, thank you for spending time with me. Every comment, every listen, and every shared story builds a workshop of wisdom where we can all craft better futures. Stay tuned for my next tale. It might involve a stubborn goat, a broken fence, or a long-lost friend, and I promise the lessons will be as real as sawdust in sunlight. Until then, keep building bridges, keep fixing what you can, and keep honoring your own story with the same care you'd give to a treasured family heirloom. And if you ever find yourself standing on shaky ground, remember my voice saying, measure twice, cut once, record when you must, and always, always choose respect.